Although it seems commonplace in the armies of today, the tank is a surprisingly new invention. They first saw action less than a century ago during the First World War. But it was in the maelstrom of World War II that this devastating invention was to find its destiny, as the biggest tank battles of history raged. Tanks came of age in the Second World War. They also developed quicker and changed more in a short 6-year period than at any time before or since. The catalyst was the demands of a technological war. Like Darwin's theory of evolution gone mad, World War II accelerated the pace of design. Fast responses to a constantly changing situation were urgently needed, and new designs had to be engineered, tested, and built in an incredibly short timescale. The average car takes 10 years to design, develop, and manufacture. In World War II, new designs were being produced in as many months. The great leap in tank design was even more astonishing, given the restrictions of the Treaty of Versailles, imposed on the defeated Germans by the Allies after World War I. It was designed to prevent Germany developing a tank capability. In 1936, only 3 years before the outbreak of World War II, Germany was heavily reliant on the small and ineffective Panzer I. It was little bigger than a modern family saloon car. But in 1939, 1,200 were in front-line service, and they formed the bulk of Germany's tank forces.
The Panzer I is really hardly worth considering as a fighting tank. It was designed originally for training. It just had a couple of machine guns in its turret. And apart from reconnaissance, you wouldn't dare send it out against other tanks. The majority of them were therefore converted to the sort of command tank role. And the purpose of a command tank is really just to provide transport for a battalion commander in the field. In other words, he can go out with his troops in their tanks, he can keep contact with them on the radio, but he's in a vehicle that will match theirs across country and gives him roughly the same sort of protection. The thing's fitted with a machine gun if he really gets into a sticky situation, but he's not meant to be fighting. He's meant to be keeping an eye on the situation and an ear and commanding his troops in action.
In the space of 3 short years, German tank technology would progress from the lightweight and inefficient Panzer I to the mighty Panzer VI, the Tiger, the most complete fighting vehicle of the war. As an example of evolution, the transformation from the Panzer I to this made the animal kingdom look positively static. Adolf Hitler was the man who provided the impetus to develop the tanks of Germany's Wehrmacht. Hitler was a gambler, and he gambled upon bluffing his enemies into believing his tank forces were far stronger than they actually were. When Hitler precipitated the Second World War with his invasion of Poland in 1939, his tank forces were questionable at best, but the gamble succeeded by the application of a new tactical doctrine, Blitzkrieg, championed by General Heinz Guderian.
Against Poland, the German command discovered a number of things which were very important. A, they didn't have the right kind of tanks. Mark I's and Mark II's were undergunned, and the second thing they discovered was you can let the tanks run as fast as you like. I think 7th Panzer Division covered about 140 miles in a week, but it runs out of fuel. So what are you going to do about that? And also tanks need maintenance. The other thing they discovered was that their artillery, the artillery support was horse-drawn. Well, obviously the rate of advance between a horse and a tank is rather different. The other thing they discovered was that their motorized division was really much, much too cumbersome. So the Germans learned a great deal from Poland. And the final lesson they learned was this: do not use tanks in a city.
At the end of the 19th century, when he proposed his theory of evolution, Charles Darwin noted that there were many branches which led to unsuccessful species, and hence to extinction. Of course, Darwin was talking about animals, but tanks, it would seem, followed exactly the same rules. In 1939, it was understood that tanks in the coming war would need to be able to deal with two kinds of different situations. The first was tank versus tank actions. Tanks are designed to survive explosions, even very close or directly upon the vehicle. Faced with the armor of a tank, explosive power alone is of little value. To destroy a tank, it is necessary to fire a shell fast enough to penetrate the hull and kill the men inside. Provided the target was close enough, the armor of most tanks of 1939 and 1940 vintage could be penetrated by relatively small caliber anti-tank weapons, such as the 50mm gun which equipped these Panzer IIIs. But armor-piercing weapons were only useful in combat against other tanks. In action against infantry in buildings and artillery targets, tanks needed to fire a high-explosive round to kill the unprotected men and disable the guns. The velocity, the speed of the shell, was relatively unimportant, but the bigger the shell, the bigger the explosion. So large-caliber guns were preferable. In this rare piece of footage, we can see how slowly high-explosive shells actually traveled. In slow motion, we can clearly see the shell leaving this German self-propelled gun as it flies towards its target. The explosion is no less impressive for the slow speed of the projectile. To achieve this destructive power and a tank-killing capability, a balanced tank force needed a mix of both anti-tank and high-explosive capability. In the opposing armies of 1939, two different solutions were found. The Germans developed two separate types of tanks, each specialized for a particular job. The first were the tank killers, equipped with a high-velocity anti-tank gun with a longer barrel of smaller caliber. Most of the Panzer IIIs of 1939 were mainly equipped with this gun, designed to deal with enemy tanks. All of the heavier Panzer IVs and even some Panzer IIIs were designed as infantry support tanks. They were equipped with a short-barreled gun of higher caliber, ideal for firing high explosives.
The Panzer IV, when it first arrived in North Africa, and the Panzer III latterly, had a short 75mm gun in the turret. This gun was designed to fire high explosive, and it therefore served in what's known as the close support role. That means the tank stays close to the infantry and uses the gun to deal with the kind of opposition they've got to face: machine gun positions, blockhouses, and light artillery. It is not really to be judged as an anti-tank weapon in the same way as, say, the British 2-pounder or the American 75. However, it had an anti-tank round which was immensely effective. But it's a question really of the use a tank is meant to be put to, and this tank was designed specifically to deal with those targets that the high-velocity anti-tank gun can't cope with.
In contrast to the Germans, who had two types of tanks, one solution tried by the armies of both France, America, and Russia was to house two types of gun in the same tank. This produced the massive multi-turreted tanks like the Char-B and the Lee Grant tank. The dual turret idea was a failure, an evolutionary blind alley which was cruelly exposed on the battlefield. The two turrets made the tank difficult to operate. It was impossible to coordinate the guns, and the sheer size of the machines presented a huge target that was difficult to miss. With the figure of her commander perched some 15 feet above the ground, it is easy to see why this Lee Grant could not be successfully hidden on the battlefield.
The main gun on the General Grant is a 75mm weapon, which not only fires solid armor-piercing shot, but can also fire high-explosive rounds. And this was the answer to Rommel's tactics of mixing tanks and anti-tank guns. You've got solid shot for dealing with the enemy tanks, and you can fire high-explosive rounds and lob them near to the enemy anti-tank gun, which would disable the crew or put them off their stroke for a while. The disadvantage on this particular tank design is that the main gun is down here in the hull. You can see there's a conventional anti-tank gun in it, but this is the gun that does the business, and having it low down in the hull is a handicap when we come to talk about the hull down position. In other words, you're using ground to hide the body of the tank and just fighting the gun looking over the ridge. It is quite clear from the height of this tank and the position of this gun that there'll be a lot of tanks sticking up in the air when it's trying to hide behind a ridge and shell an enemy position. So from a pure design point of view, this is not the best place to put a tank's gun.
Compare the large and ungainly Grant with the sleek form of this late-war German tank killer, and the advantages soon become apparent. A low silhouette, which presented a squat target, was difficult to hit, and sloping armor deflected shots away from the vehicle. As the war progressed, the same course was ultimately adopted by all sides, which was to combine both an anti-tank capability and an infantry support role in one vehicle, by mounting the largest possible high-velocity gun. The larger caliber effectively gave it a good high-explosive firing capability, as well as a deadly killing power against other tanks. In the Polish campaign of September 1939, the German generals would have loved to have such excellent tanks. Nonetheless, they were still able to provide a quick and complete victory for Hitler, despite extreme reservations about the suitability of the available tank designs and the limitations of the new tactics.
Guderian was prepared to stick his neck out for the tank and the Blitzkrieg against very considerable opposition. And it's very important to realize that, you know, the tank wasn't readily adopted. The idea of the Blitzkrieg wasn't taken to the bosom of the German High Command, quite the contrary. And therefore, Guderian really had to push it very hard indeed, and became, of course, in the course of the Second World War, if you like, the master of the German tank arm, and saw it through its early trials and into most of its major successes, and its decline as well.
Despite the concerns of the generals, Hitler had triumphed in Poland. Now his gambling instincts ran unchecked. Hitler turned his attentions to the invasion of France, and his generals grew nervous. They knew that this time there would surely be no repeat of the easy victory won in Poland. Hitler's combination of political brinkmanship and calculated gambles had disguised the fact that the German army at this time could deploy only 2,000 tanks. The British and French could count on 4,500. Not only were their numbers inferior, but many of the tanks deployed by the Germans were of limited fighting value. As we have seen, one of the main offenders in this respect was the tiny Panzer I light tank. Seen here in Bovington, this machine still bears the evidence of the shells fired through the hull which disabled it. The ease with which the thin armor of the Panzer I could be penetrated had been cruelly exposed in Poland, but some 520 machines still had to be engaged for the coming invasion of France. There was simply no alternative. Of far greater military value was the Panzer IV, then one of the best tanks in the world. But in 1940, only 200 of these machines were available, which meant that the best and most heavily armored tank available to the Wehrmacht accounted for less than 10% of the tank force. It was an oversight which could potentially have been disastrous, as throughout its long career, the Panzer IV was to prove a remarkably versatile design.
There are those who say that if the Germans had stuck to the Panzer IV and built large numbers of them, they'd done a lot better than messing about with tanks like the Tigers and Panthers. The reason is that this was a superb all-round design. It was in service when the war broke out. It was still an effective frontline tank at the end. And the reason is that the Germans built expandability into the design. Its armor thickness increases 2 or 3 times over the wartime period, and that does not affect the tank's performance at all, although it's getting heavier. And the gun, although it doesn't increase in caliber, certainly increases in size from a short-barreled 75 to this long 75, which enabled it to keep pace with developments on the other side. In other words, we would come up with tanks like the Cromwell and the Sherman. By outgunning the Panzer IV, the Germans kept pace with us and in some ways were that bit ahead of us. And it probably would have suited them better to have large numbers of these things in the field than mess about with the heavy tanks, which, for all their other virtues, were a considerable liability on the maintenance front.
Taken together with the Mark III and IV, the German tank force on the eve of the decisive battle in France deployed 500 Panzer Is, 1,000 Panzer IIs, 350 Panzer IIIs, 200 Panzer IVs, and 400 of the Czech-manufactured Panzer 38Ts. This very high proportion of light tanks would have proved hopelessly inadequate later in the war. But in 1940, evolutionary forces had not yet begun to work, and the light tanks were still capable of doing the job, but only just. But as the history books testify, Hitler was to triumph as completely in France as he had done in Poland. He did so for two reasons. Firstly, there were the poor French and British tank tactics. Although some pioneering work had been done in Britain, it was the Germans who had developed Blitzkrieg to its fullest extent, with the help of their future adversary, the Russians.
As the Germans began to be very well aware, it was the Red Army under Tukhachevsky, under Chalebsky and others who were developing the theory of what is called deep battle. In other words, operations for deep penetration using a combination of tank troops and airborne troops and, if you like, motorized infantry. So I think it's a little unfair to ascribe all of this to Little Hart and to Fuller. It was, in many respects, the practical experience which the Germans acquired in Russia, which I would regard as being perhaps the most decisive and even more important. The Russians at the same time were working out very, very complex theoretical backgrounds to this. So there was a coincidence, if you like, of the German interest and commitment and Soviet practice.
One other significant factor which led to the German victory in 1940 was that the superior French tanks were distributed in small contingents throughout the army. The German tanks, on the other hand, were concentrated together in the new panzer divisions, superbly led by able commanders. The combination of efficient battlefield tactics and inspired leadership made the difference for Hitler, but it served to disguise the many weaknesses which existed in the tank designs themselves. By the time these flaws were discovered, mercifully for the rest of humanity, it would be too late.
The German army in 39-40 was not particularly more mechanized than, say, the French army, but they made great use of being able to concentrate their forces. Much of the logistics was horse-drawn. They could range far and wide, but whenever they had to move their bases forward, much of their supplies, including the fuel, had to come in by horse. The result is that the pace of their ability to move their operations eastward was much diminished.
During 1941, the real weaknesses of the German tank designs were still not discovered. Several false conclusions were drawn from the conquest of the Balkans and Greece. These easy victories supported the continued German belief that their tanks were the best in the world. Although the design work that was to lead to the Tiger had begun, there was little real urgency. Up to the summer of 1941, Germany's main adversary had been Britain, and British tank design lagged behind Germany's. In the North African campaign, the poor performance of the British Crusader tanks only gave fresh support to the German view that the Panzer III and IVs were at least equal to anything the Allies could throw at them. The Crusader was particularly badly designed, and it was plagued by a host of mechanical failures. Eventually, the British Army lost faith in their own tanks altogether, and in 1943, when the victorious British and American forces embarked from Africa for the invasion of Italy, all of the British tanks were left behind.
Now, the Crusader is arguably one of the worst tanks Britain ever produced. It was a cruiser tank. That means it was designed to travel fast and relied on its speed far rather than its armour thickness for protection. The drawback was it was also chronically unreliable, and breakdowns became almost endemic. I am quite convinced that one of the reasons the British Army only took American tanks to Italy in 1943 was that the standard of reliability of the British machines they used in the desert, particularly as personified by the Crusader, had really actually put them off. And therefore tanks like the Grant that we've seen and the Sherman, which followed it, were reliable and therefore far more acceptable to British troops.
Despite the limitations of machines like the Crusader, in North Africa the signs were there of the dangerous flaws in Germany's tank capability. In the relative backwater of the Desert War, even the unspectacular British Matilda tank was considered a success against the Italian forces and frequently held its own against the Germans.
The gun on the Matilda, which is typical of most tanks of this period, is the 2-pounder, a 40mm weapon, but it only fired solid shot. In other words, it was only any use firing against enemy tanks. Now, this was fine under those circumstances, but once the Germans came to the desert and started mixing tanks and anti-tank guns in the attack, you needed a dual-purpose gun, something that not only fired solid shot to take out enemy tanks, but could also fire high explosive shells. And that sort of advantage comes in at last when we get the American tanks over, notably the General Grant.
Once again, superior German battlefield tactics were overcoming the limitations of her armored forces. But these successes also reinforced a leisurely attitude towards the development of new types. In 1941, the evolution of German tank design was proceeding much too slowly, and it was to have deadly consequences, from which Germany would never recover. The shock was to be delivered in Russia. When Hitler ordered the conquest of Russia in the summer of 1941, confidence among the Panzer Force was at an all-time high. The Desert War was progressing well, and the German tactics of mixing tank and anti-tank forces together concealed the deficiencies in tank design from the Germans themselves. Despite the understandable cockiness of the German High Command, a few lessons from earlier campaigns had been absorbed, and the makeup of the tank force which shook Stalin to the core had a much higher proportion of the heavier Mark III and IV tanks, instead of the lightweight Panzer I and IIs. This trend illustrated the steadily increasing reliance on heavier armor, which was to continue throughout the war. It was just as well, because the Wehrmacht was about to meet with a very nasty surprise.